The receipt was in a stack of mail on the kitchen counter. A Tuesday evening, nothing special. I was sorting through the usual things, a utility bill, a takeout menu, something from the bank, and then a folded piece of paper with my name at the top. I opened it. There was an address I didn't recognize, and a monthly charge that had been running for 7 months for a storage unit in my name. I read it 3 times before I fully accepted that it said what it said. At the bottom, printed in the standard format of a storage facility confirmation, was the unit number and the gate access code. I looked at the address, then at the code, and understood 2 things almost immediately. Whoever put that receipt in the stack either forgot it was there or wanted me to find it. I still don't know which of those 2 possibilities was worse. I took a photograph of it with my phone, then slid the receipt back exactly where I had found it, between the utility bill and the takeout menu. Now I want to find my wife. Before that receipt, I would have told you I knew what my life looked like. Kara and I had been married 8 years. We had 2 kids, a mortgage, 2 jobs, and the kind of household that only worked because both people in it kept moving. There was always something to remember, something to pay, somewhere one of us had to be. We had settled into a system early and never really had to revisit it. I handled the bills. Kara handled the schedules. Household money came out of one account. Personal spending came out of our separate ones, and neither of us treated that arrangement like a source of tension because it never had been. As far as I knew, the information I had about my own life was complete. Not perfect, not detailed down to the last small thing, but complete enough that nothing important could exist outside it without my knowing. That was the assumption the receipt broke. Before that night, if you had asked me about Kara, I wouldn't have told you she seemed suspicious. I would have said she seemed busy, maybe a little more structured than usual with her time, but not in a way that stood out enough to become a question. She had taken on a volunteer commitment that kept her out on Wednesday evenings. She had started going to the gym on Saturday mornings, which was new, but not strange. People add things to their lives. People shift routines. When you've got children and school runs and groceries and calendars and a marriage that depends on 2 people not dropping too many moving pieces at once, small changes don't necessarily look like signals. They just look like life. That Tuesday night, she was in the kitchen with me while I went through the mail. She was standing at the counter, chopping something for dinner, not facing me directly, but close enough that I could hear the knife against the board, close enough that if I had said her name in a different tone, she would have turned around immediately. I sorted through the stack with her 2 feet away from me. Utility bill, takeout menu, something from the bank. Then that folded receipt with my name at the top. I opened it, read it, photographed it, and slid it back into the stack without saying a word. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and watched her finish making dinner, trying to understand what exactly I was looking at now that I knew there was something in my name that had existed for 7 months without me. And the worst part, even then, was not just the receipt. It was how normal the room still felt around it. The next day, while I was at work, I looked up the storage facility online. It was exactly what you would expect a place like that to be. 24-hour access, climate-controlled units available, month-to-month contracts, a clean website designed to make rented space sound harmless. I found the unit size listed on the receipt and matched it to the chart on the site. 10 by 10. Medium unit. Enough for boxes, furniture, appliances, the kind of square footage people use when they're between places or quietly making room for a second version of their life. The website said it could comfortably hold the contents of a 1-bedroom apartment. I read that sentence twice, then a 3rd time, because once it was in my head, it changed the scale of everything. Until then, I had been trying to tell myself it might still be small. Something inconvenient, but explainable. A mistake. A temporary fix for something practical she hadn't mentioned yet. But a 10 by 10 unit wasn't a practical oversight. It was space with intention behind it. That afternoon, during my lunch break, I pulled my credit report from my work computer. I didn't do it because I thought there had to be more. I did it because I needed to know whether there was more before I let my imagination go any further than it already had. I sat there in an empty office with the report open on the screen, checking every account, every line item, every name I recognized, and the one I didn't. The storage unit was the only thing on there that wasn't mine. 7 months of small charges, each one ordinary enough to disappear into the background of a shared financial life. Each one too small to force itself into memory unless you already had a reason to notice it. I closed the report and still didn't feel any better. That evening, before I went into the house, I called Marcus. Kara's older brother lived across town, and I wasn't calling because I thought he was involved in anything. I called because he was one of the few people adjacent to her I trusted to answer a question straight if one happened to come up sideways. So I kept the conversation casual. Work, kids, nothing important. Then near the end, I mentioned that I'd been thinking about getting a storage unit for some overflow from the garage and asked if he'd ever used one nearby. He said no. Then he paused. And after that pause, he said Kara had mentioned something about storage a while back. He said he had assumed we had already figured something out between us. I told him, as evenly as I could, that we were still working it out. Then I ended the call and sat in my car in the driveway for almost 20 minutes because now it wasn't just the unit itself. It was the fact that there had already been a conversation about storage, and somehow her brother had been closer to it than I was, even though the thing had been rented in my name. 2 days after I found the receipt, I drove to the storage facility on a Thursday morning before work. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I didn't tell Kara, and I didn't tell Marcus, and I didn't even really admit to myself what I expected to find there. I had the address from the receipt and the photograph on my phone, and the whole drive there I kept thinking about how close it was. 12 minutes from the house. Close enough that you could get there easily whenever you needed to, far enough that you would never end up there by accident. That bothered me more than I expected it to. Distance means something when someone chooses it. When I pulled into the lot, I stayed in the car for a minute with the engine still running. The gate keypad was visible from where I was parked, and I remember looking at it and thinking how strange it was that I already had the code, like I had been invited into something without anyone meaning to invite me. After a minute, I turned the engine off, got out, and walked to the gate. The code worked. The gate opened without hesitation, and just like that, I was inside a place I hadn't known existed 48 hours earlier. It took me a few minutes to find the unit. The layout was more confusing than it looked from the road. Rows of identical doors and narrow lanes that all seemed designed to make you lose your sense of direction just enough to stop paying attention. When I found the number from the receipt, I stopped in front of it and just stood there for a second. Standard roll-up door. Standard padlock. Nothing about it looked dramatic or strange. That was part of what made it unsettling. It looked like any other unit. Like whatever was inside belonged to someone with an ordinary reason for needing extra space. I took a picture of the unit number and the lock, then went back to my car. That should have been the end of it for that morning. I knew that. I also knew I wasn't leaving. I sat there thinking about numbers. The ones Kara used when she didn't want to forget something. Her birthday. Her mother's birthday. The year we got married. The number of the house she grew up in. I told myself it was ridiculous that if she had locked something away like this, she wouldn't use anything obvious, and then I went back anyway. The first 3 combinations didn't work. The 4th one did. The lock clicked open in my hand with a softness that was almost worse than if it had resisted me. I remember just standing there for a second with the padlock loose and the metal door still shut, because up to that point there had still been room, however small, for some explanation I hadn't thought of yet. Then I pulled the door up and looked inside. And whatever I had expected, it wasn't that. Inside the unit there were boxes. Not 1 or 2, not the kind of random overflow you tell yourself you'll deal with later, but 10 or 12 of them, packed neatly and lined up with enough space between them that it was obvious this had not been done in a rush. Kara's handwriting was on all of them. Kitchen, books, clothes, winter, documents, kids' things. Against the back wall, there were pieces of flat-pack furniture leaning upright, a lamp wrapped in a sheet, and 2 framed photographs I recognized from our house immediately, the kind I had assumed were tucked away somewhere because we'd redecorated and never gotten around to putting them back up. I stood there just inside the door, looking at all of it, and for the first few seconds I didn't touch anything. I was trying to understand what I was looking at before I let myself react to it. It looked less like storage than preparation. That was the part one couldn't get around. This wasn't a pile of things someone had moved out of the way temporarily. This was a life being separated out, sorted, labeled, and held somewhere just outside the house until the rest of the plan caught up with it. I finally stepped forward and opened one box, the one labeled documents, because that felt like the place where whatever this was would be forced to say its own name. Inside were copies of financial records, lease agreements, utility setup guides, and a folder with a name on it I didn't recognize, followed by the word apartment. I took that folder out and opened it standing there in the unit with the door still half raised behind me. Inside was a printed email confirmation for an apartment application. The applicant name was Karis. The application had been submitted 6 weeks earlier. The apartment was available from the 1st of next month. I read that page once, then again, not because I hadn't understood it the first time, but because some part of me still wanted there to be a version of it that meant less than it did. There wasn't one. By then, the shape of it was clear. The boxes, the labels, the apartment, the unit in my name, the 7 months of quiet payments. This wasn't fear in the abstract. This wasn't a backup plan someone kept to feel safer and never intended to use. This was movement. I put the folder back exactly where I had found it, closed the box, lowered the door, spun the lock shut, and walked back to my car. I sat there in the lot for a long time afterward, not in the dramatic kind of shock, but the functional kind, the kind that feels almost like clarity. Kara had been packing pieces of our life into a storage unit rented in my name, and somewhere in the middle of that, she had applied for an apartment and never said a word to me about any of it. Then I drove to work. I didn't call her. I didn't cancel my meetings. I sat through the morning saying the right things at the right times while one fact sat underneath every other thought I had. My wife was leaving. She just didn't know yet that I knew. I gave myself 3 days before I said anything. Not because I was trying to build some clever strategy, and not because I thought waiting would make it hurt less, but because I needed to know what I actually wanted to say before I stood in front of her and said it. I'm not built for long games. I've never been good at pretending I know less than I do. But this was different. By then I knew enough that if I spoke too soon, I was going to say the first true thing instead of the right one. And the first true thing is not always the one you can live with afterward. So I watched, not in a theatrical way, not pacing around the house or checking up on her every 5 minutes, but with the kind of attention that only comes after context changes. Once you know what you know, everything rearranges itself around it. The ordinary things stop being ordinary. Kara was warm with the kids, normal with me. She asked about my day. She made dinner twice in those 3 days. On Friday evening, she sat beside me on the couch while something mindless played on television, and neither of us was really watching it. I sat through all of it with a new knowledge sitting under every movement she made, and what unsettled me most was how easy she still was in the life she was preparing to leave. I kept looking for the exit in everything she did, and once I started seeing it, I found it everywhere. On the second day, I called a lawyer I knew professionally, not because I was ready to talk about divorce or anything close to it, but because I needed one practical answer. I asked him if a storage unit rented in my name without my knowledge left me exposed to the contract in any real way. He said technically yes, because as far as the paperwork was concerned, I was the account holder. He said he could look into it properly and call me back. I told him not to bother, that I would handle it another way. And then I hung up. I wasn't ready to hand the thing over to process yet. I still needed to hear it from her. On the third night, after the kids were in bed, I found her in the kitchen cleaning up. I didn't start with a speech. I just took out my phone, pulled up the picture of the receipt, and set it on the counter between us. Then I waited. She looked down at it, and I watched her understand exactly what it meant that I was showing it to her now. She set down what she was holding and said my name in a voice that wasn't panicked, just tired like some part of her had been expecting this moment for a while and had finally run out of places to keep it. I told her I had been to the unit. That landed harder than the receipt had. She asked me when. I told her 3 days ago. She stood there taking that in, then said I had known for 3 days, and I told her yes, I had. There was a silence after that, and she leaned back against the counter, not frightened exactly, but with the look of someone standing in front of a door they always knew was there and can't pretend not to see anymore. Then she said she had been going to tell me, and all I could think was, I know. I just got there first. We sat at the kitchen table after that, and for the first time since I'd found the receipt, it felt like we were finally in the same conversation. Kara told me what she had been planning, and she did it plainly. She had intended to tell me at the end of the month, after the apartment was confirmed, after she had a move date, after the practical side of it was settled well enough that she wouldn't have to speak in possibilities. She said she didn't want to have the conversation before she had somewhere to go, because without the logistics in place, she was afraid she would let herself be talked out of it. She said that without apology, and strangely, that made it easier to hear. An apology there would have sounded softer, but it would have made the truth less clean. This at least was clean. I asked her how long she had felt this way, and she said it had been building for about 2 years. Most of that time, she told me, she had kept trying to explain it away to herself. She told herself it was a phase, that every long marriage goes through stretches where the life starts to feel heavier than it used to, that the kids needed stability, and she owed it to all of us to stay still long enough for the feeling to pass. She said renting the unit was the point where she stopped saying those things to herself and did something concrete instead. That was the first real action, and once she had done it, she said it felt like finally. Then I asked about Marcus. She didn't dodge that either. She told me she had spoken to him about it 3 months earlier, not in full detail, not with the apartment or the storage unit or the exact timeline, but enough that he knew she was thinking about making a change. She said she needed one person who knew, someone outside the house, someone who could hear it without being inside the consequences of it. I asked why that person had been him and not me, and she was quiet for a moment before she answered. Then she said telling me would have made it real in a different way, and she hadn't been ready for that version of real until she had somewhere to put it. After that, I came back to the part one still couldn't let go of. I told her she had rented it in my name. She said she knew. I asked why, and for the first time that night, she hesitated. She looked at the table, then said she hadn't wanted a paper trail that started the conversation before she was ready to have it. Then she stopped again, and I asked what else there was. She said she thought some part of her knew I would find it eventually, and some part of her had been all right with that. I remember looking at her for a long time after that. Then I told her she had left me a door. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, she said maybe, and even then I could hear she knew that maybe wasn't the whole truth. By then the question had changed shape in my head. I was no longer trying to work out whether the storage unit had been a secret or an invitation. I was trying to understand whether that distinction mattered at all once the boxes were packed and the apartment had been chosen and the leaving had already started in every way except the one that required my name to be said out loud. I told Kara I needed one full conversation, not a negotiation, and not the kind of conversation where two people circle the truth carefully enough that neither of them has to feel it all at once. I told her I didn't want to talk about whether this could be undone or whether there was still a version of us somewhere in the future that looked enough like the old one to be comforting. I wanted one night where both of us said what was true without adjusting it to protect the other person from hearing it. She looked at me for a moment, then said okay, and we sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight while the kids slept upstairs and the house got quieter and quieter around us, in that strange way a house does when it feels like it is listening. I told her what the last 3 days had been like from my side. Not dramatically, and not as a performance of pain, because by then I was too tired for that. I just told her what it had actually felt like to move through ordinary hours knowing what I knew, while she moved through the same hours not knowing that I knew it. I told her what it had been like to sit on the couch Friday night with her beside me, both of us facing the television, while I was carrying the image of that storage unit in my head, and she was still living inside the version of the marriage she thought she had time to explain later. I told her there's a specific kind of cruelty in that. Even when it isn't meant cruelly, the performance of a normal life after one person has already started leaving it. She said she hadn't been trying to hurt me. I told her I knew, and that it was almost harder because of that. Then she asked what I wanted from the conversation, and I told her I wanted to understand what the last 2 years had actually been from her side, not the edited version built around readiness, but the one that had been true while we were still living inside it. She warned me it was going to be hard to hear, and I told her I had already been to the storage unit, already read the apartment application, already stood in front of packed boxes with my name on the account. There was nothing she could tell me now that would hit harder than what I had already found in that box. After that, she nodded and said okay. Then she gave me the real version. Some of it landed like confirmation, things I had felt without ever naming. Some of it was new. All of it was true. I could hear that immediately, and the strange thing was that even then, maybe especially then, I could still tell when she was telling the truth. After 9 years, that was still there. I remember realizing, somewhere in the middle of listening to her, that it was one of the things I was going to miss most. By the time we stopped talking, nothing was fixed, and nothing had become simple. But the pretense was over. The unit had been named. The apartment had been named. The 2 years had been laid out between us in the form they had actually happened. And for the first time in 3 days, maybe longer, I felt something I didn't have a word for right away. Later, I decided the word was level. Not better, not safer, not saved. Just level. For the first time since I found the receipt, we were standing on the same ground. The next 2 weeks were about logistics. Not emotions, not decisions, not questions that didn't have answers yet. Just the practical shape of something ending. Kara's apartment was confirmed. A move date was set. Boxes that had already been packed in that storage unit now had somewhere to go. Everything that had existed as preparation started turning into movement. We told the kids on a Sunday afternoon. We sat them down in the living room the way we had agreed to. Both of us there, both of us calm, no blame, no version of the story that made one of us the reason and the other one the result. We told them things were going to change, that they would still have both of us, that nothing about how we felt about them was shifting. I held it together through the conversation, and for about 20 minutes after, answering their questions, making sure the tone stayed steady, making sure it felt as contained as something like that can feel. Then I went out to the garage. I sat on the steps in there for a while. I didn't cry. I'm not sure what I did exactly. I just sat with it, with the fact that something I had thought of as fixed had now been named as temporary in a way that couldn't be reversed. After a while, I went back inside and made dinner. A few days later, I contacted a lawyer, a divorce attorney this time, recommended by a colleague. Kara and I had already agreed we weren't going to turn this into something combative, that we were going to handle it as cleanly as possible, but the lawyers still said the same thing they probably say to everyone in that position. That everyone says that at the beginning. I told them I understood, but that I meant it. The first meeting was procedural, forms and timelines and steps that made the end of a marriage sound like something you could organize if you follow the right sequence. When I drove home afterward, the house was still full of her things. It was going to be for another 3 weeks. I stood in the hallway for a second after I came in, looking at everything the way you look at something you know you're about to lose, but don't have to give up just yet, and I couldn't decide if that made it easier or harder. The week before she moved out, Marcus called me. He said he was sorry for not telling me, that he should have found a way. I told him I understood, that it hadn't been his information to share, and I meant that. He said it didn't feel like enough, and I told him I thought it would have happened the same way regardless of when I found out. What mattered was that I had found out before I spent more time living inside something I didn't understand. He said he didn't know how I was being this reasonable. I told him I wasn't sure I was. I said I was just trying to be accurate, and that was the only thing that felt possible at that point, to look at what was actually happening without adding anything to it or taking anything away, To sit inside a house that was still full of her things and know that it wasn't ours in the same way anymore. And to understand that there's a space between something ending and something being gone. And that space has to be lived in whether you are ready for it or not. Kara moved out on a Saturday. I took the kids to my brother's house for the day, so they wouldn't have to watch it happen. So their last memory of the house didn't involve boxes being carried past them or doors opening and closing on something they didn't have a say in. When I came back that evening, the house felt different in a way that was hard to describe but easy to recognize. Some things were gone. Some things were still there. The spaces where things had been felt more present than the things that remained. I walked through each room once, not looking for anything specific, just taking in what it felt like now that the version of it I had been living in was no longer intact. Then I made dinner for the kids, put them to bed, and sat in the kitchen for a long time afterward, in the same place where I had found the receipt. The following week, I called the storage facility. I told them I needed my name removed from the account. The manager handled it the way people handle things they see every day. There was a form, a transfer of responsibility, a few signatures that turned something shared into something singular. He didn't ask why, and I didn't offer anything. 5 minutes of paperwork, and it was done. 7 months of charges in my name for something I hadn't known existed. I settled the balance, signed where I was told to sign, and left. On the way out, I passed the gate and didn't look at it. I still knew the code. I knew I wasn't going to use it again. A few weeks later, I found myself thinking about something Kara had said that night in the kitchen. That some part of her had been okay with me finding the receipt. I turned that over more times than I expected to, trying to decide what it meant. At first, I read it as something worse than it needed to be, something that made the whole thing feel more deliberate, more constructed. But the more I sat with it, the more it started to settle into a different shape. She hadn't been trying to hurt me. She hadn't been trying to trap me into anything. She had made a decision she couldn't say out loud yet. And somewhere underneath all the planning and the timing and the care she had taken to control when it would become real, there was a part of her that needed the moment to arrive from outside her. She needed someone to open the door. And whether I understood that at the time or not, I was the one who did. I said that to my brother once, weeks after she had moved out. I told him about the name, the combination, the receipt in the mail. He said it sounded like she wanted me to find it. I told him part of her did. I told him I used to think that made it worse, and now I thought it meant she didn't know how to end something she had already left. He said that wasn't nothing. I told him no, it wasn't. I don't know what my life looks like a year from now. I know what it looks like today. The kids asleep down the hall. The kitchen where I stood on a Tuesday evening sorting through a stack of mail. The gate code I still remember and won't ever use again. I didn't go looking for any of this. I found it by accident, and then I made a series of decisions that led me here. And if I had to, I would make them all again. I still think about how small it looked, that receipt in the middle of a stack of ordinary mail, and how something that quiet can split a life open without making a sound. What stays with me now is not the unit. It's the fact that my name was on the door before I ever knew it existed. I'm over at where silence ends. If someone left you the trail instead of saying the words, would that feel like honesty or cowardice?